I'm here with Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Alexander, let's talk about the Moscow rallies that turned into clashes in the center of Moscow on Tverskaya Street, actually. And there was the latest count was at around 3,500 to 4,000 people attended these rallies. And I've heard numbers anywhere from 600 to 1,000 people were detained. I mean, there's been a lot of video going around the internet, Twitter, etc., which tries to highlight the brutality of the Moscow police as they were subduing these rallies. I mean, it got violent. It was obvious that it got violent. But take us one step back, Alexander, and explain what this rally was about and how it led to these clashes, and then let's segue into the people that were spearheading these rallies, Navalny and Sobol.
Right. Well, these rallies are related to elections, local elections, which are happening in Moscow in September. Russia has local governments, as every other city does, and a local parliament with 45 MPs and various liberal, I say liberal, these are ultra-liberal, pro-Western, as Russians say, non-system politicians tried to stand for election to this particular parliament. And in Russia, as in many other countries, it's important to stress this, that before you are allowed to stand for election at any level, you have to pass certain qualifications or criteria. In Britain, for example, it usually involves payment of a deposit, which can be quite a hefty deposit. In Russia, you have to obtain signatures from the residents of the area where you are standing, and enough signatures to qualify as a candidate. Now, the political parties, the main political parties, don't have to do that because they're already well registered. They already have registration to be able to put up candidates. But these ultra-liberal politicians, their political parties are not represented in the parliament because they've never managed to win enough support to get into the parliament, so they have to collect these signatures. And they try to collect these signatures, and the Electoral Commission, Russia's Electoral Commission, went through the signatures, and they decided that a lot of them were faked. Now, by the way, this is not the first time that has happened. There have been several occasions when, as I said, liberal politicians have tried, these ultra-liberal politicians have tried to stand for important bodies of power. Yavlinsky tried this with the presidential election in 2012, I think. And they have struggled to get enough signatures to qualify. And in Yavlinsky's case in 2012, he was disqualified because it was said that he'd faked, many of the signatures were faked. And the same allegation has been made here. Now, some people are disputing this. They say all these signatures are true and genuine. I'm not going to get into a debate about this. The one thing I would say is that the head of the Central Electoral Commission, who is a woman called Ella Pamfilova, is a very well-known liberal herself. She was formerly a minister in one of Boris Yeltsin's governments. She is known to be somebody who is sympathetic to liberal views. She doesn't seem to me very like the sort of person who would disqualify candidates in this way by denying signatures that were genuine. I merely mentioned that. I've no doubt at all that there are legal processes where you could get this decision overturned if it was wrong, but these people have decided to protest instead. So there was a demonstration about a week ago, a completely legal and authorized demonstration. Demonstrations can be authorized in Russia, and this one was authorized. 12,000 people turned out, which is about the number of the liberal protest community in Moscow. In a demonstration in Moscow on any specific issue, the liberals will usually get around 12 to 20,000 people turning up. They claim it was 22,000. The police say it was 12,000, but that gives you the order of magnitude. That was a perfectly legal, legitimate demonstration. And then what happened is that Alexei Navalny became involved. Now, Navalny is a person who is always spoken about as a liberal. He is not a liberal. He is a person with a very authoritarian perspective on Russian politics. He's genuinely racist. I know this is a problem because, of course, this word racism is so overused nowadays to describe all kinds of people. But I mean, I've read things that Navalny has said which are openly and strongly racist. And if they were said by someone like Donald Trump, for example, or Nigel Farage in Britain, or God help us, Tommy Robinson, then it would get them into serious trouble. But Navalny says them in Russia, and this doesn't seem to be a concern for the media here, that the media in the West, which backs him. And Navalny not only is, extremely racist, but and authoritarian in his politics, but he has a consistent practice of staging demonstrations without permission in order to provoke incidents which can then be shown in the international media as proving police brutality and the repression of Putin's regime, as it's always called. And this is what he did again in this protest. He decided that he was going to march on the mayoralty. The mayor, by the way, who's a man called Sobyanin, who's a popular figure in Moscow, is not due for re-election. He won re-election a short time ago, and he's a massively popular figure in Moscow. But anyway, there was an attempt to march on the mayoralty, which is located on Tverskaya, which is one of the big streets in Moscow, disrupting traffic, causing chaos. And there was never any possibility that this protest would get permission, because you do not block Russia's main road artery by allowing a protest there. So the police reacted and broke up this protest, which, as I said, the number of people involved was around 3,500. The police say about 700 of them were journalists from presumably the West, some from Russia, no doubt. And this is the pattern of what Navalny always does. He has repeatedly staged protests in Moscow, which are unauthorized, in order to create an appearance of violence in Moscow, which can then be projected around the world, and which will keep him at the center of attention by establishing him as the center of the anti-Putin opposition in Russia, in the international media. Now, as I said, I think most Russians, I think the overwhelming majority of Russians can see through this thing. But of course, the international media has no interest in doing so. So that's what we've seen happen. I don't think we should exaggerate the importance of this event. As I said, not many people were involved objectively. And there might have been a genuine grievance about the disqualification of the candidates. But once again, Navalny has been allowed to hijack it.
Yeah, I've actually been at one of Navalny's events about a year and a half ago. I was actually, it was in Pushkinskaya. And it was, the best I can describe it is that the crowd that was there would probably be something like what you'd see at an Antifa event in the US. I mean, it's just very fringe. I mean, Moscow's a city of 15, 20 million people. And this protest was also like around maybe 3,000-4,000 people. And it was the very fringe of society, it seemed. Very, very odd looking people. I mean, it's the best way I can describe it. A lot of racism. And Navalny in Moscow, he is a known, I mean, the real deal, not like what they say in the US, racist. No. This guy's a real racist. I mean, he hates anybody that is not, the pure
Yes.
Slavic, white, Russian. I mean, he hates anybody.
Yes.
Greek. You know, if he saw me, he would just hate me. So I mean, he's like that, and it's really interesting, Alexander, to see, you know, the United States and the Europeans and the EU came out with a statement, to see them championing this guy. I mean, it's beyond upside down clownish. But I guess, you know, if anything to perpetuate this, you know, Putin regime kind of stereotype, they'll go for it.
I mean, I think what one should explain is that the media in the West has been following this narrative for around a year, that Putin is losing support as a result of the pension reforms that he carried out last year and the VAT increase that Russia went through at the beginning of this year, and that this loss of support would translate into protests, that there would be a big protest season this summer. So I think part of the agenda behind all of this is to give some appearance of reality to these claims by having Navalny stage his usual, you correctly say, anti-Fa protests in Moscow. They're not anti-Fa. They're the opposite of anti-Fa. They are far. I mean, they are almost. Well, they're certainly fringe, but they're ultra racist and very peculiar. But have them and then report them in the West as proof of Putin's loss of popularity and loss of popular support. Now, the reality is that over the last couple of weeks, Putin's support has been getting stronger again as the economy has stabilized. Well, it's not stable, but has started to grow more strongly. And as the effect of the pension reform and the VAT increase has ebbed. Also, I mean, it also has to be said that the one thing that is guaranteed to rally support behind Putin is media focus on Navalny and this activity that he does in places like Tverskaya in Moscow. I mean, it's difficult to explain to people who don't know Moscow how disruptive a protest on Tverskaya is. I mean, Tverskaya is the most important street in Moscow.
The main artery.
It's the main artery. Exactly. I mean, it will cause great inconvenience and anger amongst the people of Moscow. And Navalny at one time did have a pool of support in Moscow. That has dwindled as a consequence of these tactics. And I understand that he's planning to restage the whole thing all over again in a week's time, which is his usual practice. And that will that will exasperate people even more. And as I said, what I predict will happen is that within a short time, we'll start to see Putin's support levels ticking up even further, because he will be seen in Russia as the great defender of order and law in the country from people like Navalny, who are the disruptor in chief. But this is something that the Western media is not really concerned about, because they're not concerned with Russian reality so much anymore, I think. They're more concerned with perpetuating narratives. And the narrative they're following at the moment is that Putin's popularity is slipping, and therefore his regime is somehow coming under greater stress, and that this is why he's reacting by sending out the riot police to violently disperse protesters against himself. So, that's what it's all about. There's a lot of theater behind this thing.
And Navalny is not even that popular a figure in Russia. I mean, he's not that popular a figure in Moscow, but in Russia, he's relatively unknown. I would even say, Alexander, he's more popular in Europe and in Brussels and in DC and with the neocons than he is in Moscow. I think that's without a doubt.
No question about it. As I said, in 2013, when there was the mayoral election in Moscow, he got more votes than some people expected. But actually, that was a bit of an illusion, because, in fact, turnout in that election was very low, and that made his support seem greater than it really was. But since then, all the indications are that his support, such as it was, has declined. he does have a claque of supporters in Moscow. I love your description of them as sort of fringe Antifa types, because that's what they are. And there are some other liberal politicians, like a man called Gudkov, a man called Yashin, Navalny's own right hand, who's a woman called Lyubov Sobol, who, by the way, has been investigating, if that's the right word, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is the person who ran the so-called troll farm in St. Petersburg. And that, of course, is something that the Western media have been playing up, because Prigozhin is supposed to be playing a big role in Russiagate and has been indicted by Mueller, but, that's another story. But some people have latched on to this, but they're all marginal characters. All the really important political figures in Russia are playing no part on it. And as for Navalny himself being not very popular in Russia, I think most Russians actually do know of Navalny, because he gets talked about so much in the Western media. They know about him and they loathe him. He is a very disliked man. And that's, I think, something that the media in the West seems to find it impossible to understand.
Yeah, he would make many trips in and out of the U.S. Embassy as well. So, I mean, I think it's, his intentions are not exactly for the best interests of Russia, I would say.
No,
that's my opinion on the matter.
They're not. They're not. But can I just also say something else, which is, of course, that the damage someone like this does, not so much Navalny himself, because in any city there are protests. Big city like Moscow, capital city, you will find these sort of types who protest and create trouble, and the police come and clear them out. I mean, it happens in New York with it happens in Washington D.C.
Well, I was going to ask you about the media goes crazy for this small protest in Moscow, but they don't cover, how many consecutive weeks of what's going on in France with the yellow vests.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's exactly right. So, I mean, you have all this, but the amount of attention that Navalny gets does have one bad effect in Russia, because, as I said, it boosts Putin's control, his popularity, because, as I said, he's seen as the man who's holding Russia to, the line against Western interference. And that makes it more difficult for real political parties like, the Liberal Democratic Party, the Communist Party, the Just Russia Party, that are represented in the Russian parliament to form an electoral challenge to him. So the result is that you consolidate Putin and you take away some of the energy from Russian politics that should be there. Lots of Russians have complained about this to me. I remember a year ago, I was in Moscow just before the presidential elections, in which Putin won overwhelmingly. And the sign that was all over Moscow was, our elections, our president. Now, our made it very clear this is for Russians. It's not for outsiders. And Navalny, doing all of these things, again reminds them that other countries, the United States, Britain, the West, has this agenda for Russia, which, of course, Russians oppose. And that interferes with their politics and slows down the natural evolution that Russian politics might themselves have. But yeah, let's not exaggerate the importance of this thing. As I said, he might be able to bring together another protest in a week's time, but sooner or later this thing will fade. Yeah,
I think sooner or later it will die down. But I think the interesting point there, Alexander, to wrap it up, is that the more the West and Brussels and DC and all these guys, the more they support Navalny, the more they strengthen Putin, and the more they weaken real opposition parties, real parties with real candidates and the real ability to form an opposition to Putin, a democratic, properly structured opposition to Putin. So the more they support, fringe weirdos like Navalny, the more they sabotage themselves.
It's based on a fundamental misunderstanding of Russian society and of Russian politics. And by the way, I mean, I should add, I mean, you know, you're absolutely right when you say that Navalny, to the extent that he has any support, it's entirely in Moscow. If you go outside Moscow, I mean, as I said, he's an overwhelmingly disliked figure. And the view that he has this tremendous following amongst Russian youth, I mean, it could not be more wrong. I mean, I've spent time with Russian students, and I know what kind of political views they have, and they don't share. They don't like Navalny. So, as I said, this is a completely false narrative that is being created. But I think partly, as I said, this is also done for Western consumption, because you need to sort of project this image all the time of the Russian dictatorship of Putin as the great dictator of Russia, and you mustn't ever let anybody think that Russia is a genuine democracy. So the idea, you know, this image was somewhat shaken last year when Westerners went to the World Cup in Moscow. But you know, you now have all these photos and all these images of all these very strange people, as you correctly say, blocking up Tverskaya, and you have the riot police there, and now that's the image that is going to be circulated around the world.
Yeah, 3,500 is really not that big of a protest. I mean, in Greece, we get like 50 to 70,000 people who descend on Syntagma Square.
Well,
I mean, 3,500 is considered very, very small, especially for a city of 15 million, 20 million.
Well, of course. And if 700 of them really were journalists, I mean, what does that tell you?
Yeah, the truth is probably 400, but still, that's a lot of journalists.
Yes. Well, that's the point. I mean, you know, it gets overwhelming coverage, and it's part, as I said, of this game that is being played. Now, as I said, there might have been a genuine grievance with these signatures. I doubt it, by the way. As I said, I don't believe Ella Pamphilova would be part of such a trick. But if there is, then that cause is being lost, because, as I said, Navalny has been allowed to hijack it.
Yeah, and God, if someone to close down Tverskaya is like, Moscow already has terrible traffic problems and terrible traffic issues. I just can't imagine closing down Tverskaya even for 10 minutes. The amount of damage that does to the city.
No, absolutely. I mean, it stops everything working. As I said, it's not going to be a popular thing with the overwhelming majority of Muscovites at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Thank you very much. Guys, if you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below. Click on the notifications bell to make sure you get notifications every time we push out a new video. And you can get a copy of this video in audio format. Follow us on iTunes and SoundCloud. Please also donate to the Duran via PayPal, via Patreon, and we are now on Subscribestar as well. So your donation helps keep this channel up and running. And another thing that helps keep this channel up and running is when you visit the Duran shop and you can pick up merchandise, clothing, mugs, stickers, tank tops, hoodies, or you can pick up something to read. And we are now selling 2 ebooks at a great price on Russiagate. So Alexander, those ebooks, you wrote a forward to those ebooks, and you're also wearing some Duran merchandise, and you're drinking.
I'm drinking some Duran merchandise.
As am I.
as are you. But can I just speak about the books? Because, of course, this is interesting, because, of course, we were talking about how a narrative has been constructed about Russia and how that features Navalny. And we had a narrative constructed about Russiagate, which is now disintegrating. And it's a very complicated story about, you know, Trump being in collusion with the Russians and all of this. So one of our books, because it's 2 books, one of our books unpacks that. We explain how Russiagate originated as a plot to get Hillary Clinton elected, because that's what it was. And it involved all kinds of people in the Democratic Party, in the media, in the intelligence agencies. And it seems to have had a long back story going all the way back to 2015. And eventually it got completely out of control. It became a huge, all-encompassing thing, and it was a fiction. Just as, Navalny's protests in Moscow are essentially a fictional event. Anyway, one book looks at that. The other book looks at the investigations this has generated, the Mueller investigation, and how that got completely out of control, and explains how William Barr, the new Attorney General of the United States, a man practiced in looking at reality, came in and brought it all to a stop, and by doing so, saved the American Republic. So again, we are looking at reality versus fiction in both instances, and that's what our books are about. And I think they will help people to understand Russiagate better. And the way to read these books is to read these books while drinking from a mug like this, which is a fantastic mug, beautiful, wonderful Duran mug. I'm drinking tea from it at the moment. Now, this is, as I said, the crest of Alpha, the elite Russian Special Forces unit. So a mug like that has to have a Russian tea of a kind that those sorts of tough soldiers of Alpha will probably be drinking, which in this case is Russian caravan tea. And it's a fantastic mug to drink tea from. Now, the mug that you have there, Alex, I think is got the double-headed eagle of Russia. This is the current double-headed eagle that the Russians have. It's on Putin's cups. It's on the Kremlin's mugs and plates and things like that. And of course, that compares with our double-headed eagle, which you can see here on this absolutely fabulous long-sleeved T-shirt. It's become cooler and more rainy here, so this is a perfect T-shirt to wear. 100% cotton, beautifully dyed, fits magnificently. So help the Duran, buy one of these magnificent shirts. We've got lots of other sorts of shirts. We've got hats, we've got hoodies, we've got all sorts of other things. We're planning to have still more things. Buy yourself one of these mugs and refresh yourself with one of these mugs and read one of our books and help the Duran by doing all these things.
Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran, thank you very much. A link to the Duran shop is in the description box down below. So pick something up and help us out. Until next time, everybody, take care.